At an elite charity gala, a cruel socialite rips a 7-year-old's dress to wipe a single drop of juice from her shoe. She sneers, feeling powerful, completely unaware that the little girl's billionaire father just saw everything. She just made an enemy of a man who can buy countries. So what will he do to her? Welcome to our channel. Before we find out how this billionaire gets his revenge, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is in the comments below. And if you're ready to see justice served, like this video and subscribe so you never miss a story. The air in the grand ballroom of the Bostonian hotel wasn't merely air, it was a currency. It was thick with the scent of money, a cloying blend of imported orchids, vintage champagne, and the kind of perfume that cost more per ounce than gold. Crystal chandeliers, vast and intricate as frozen galaxies, dripped light onto a sea of curated perfection. Men in bespoke tuxedos moved like sleek sharks through shallow water, their smiles sharp and fleeting. Women, draped in silk and diamonds, laughed with a musical precision that never quite reached their eyes. This was the Boston Annual Charity Gala, a gilded cage where the city's elite gathered to celebrate their own generosity, the price of admission a casual testament to their dominance. And through it all moved Spencer Reed. He was a titan in this world, yet not of it. Where the old money scions of Boston's Brahmin families carried their legacy with a practiced, almost weary ease, Spencer wore his power like a perfectly tailored suit of armor. It was earned, not inherited, and it showed in the quiet intensity of his gaze. He was a predator of a different sort, one who'd built a tech empire from a garage and a revolutionary idea, and the old guard both feared and courted him for it. They saw the self-made billionaire, the disruptor. They didn't see the man who felt more at home in a server room than in a ballroom. A small tug on his hand pulled him from his observations. He looked down, and the entire, suffocating room seemed to recede, the cacophony of feigned interest fading to a distant hum. "Daddy," a small voice whispered, "is that lady's hair made of cotton candy?" Spencer's lips, which had been set in a firm, neutral line, broke into a genuine smile. He knelt, the fine wool of his trousers creasing as he brought himself down to her level, creating a private world for just the two of them amidst the throng. "I think that's what she was going for, Starlight," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that was for her ears only. "But I wouldn't recommend trying to eat it." Claire Reed, all of 7 years old, giggled. Her eyes, the same sharp, intelligent blue as her father's, scanned the room with a child's unfiltered honesty. In her custom silk dress, a shimmering cascade of moonlight-colored fabric, she was the single point of authentic light in the vast, glittering expanse. She was his anchor, the reason this hollow spectacle had any meaning at all. She was the warm, beating heart in a cold room full of veiled transactions and social maneuvering. "Why does everyone talk so quietly?" she asked, her own voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Because they're afraid someone might hear what they're really thinking," Spencer answered, smoothing a stray strand of her blonde hair. He stood, his hand once again enveloping hers. He navigated the crowd with an effortless grace, nodding curtly to a banking magnate here, offering a tight, dismissive smile to a city councilman there. He was a master of this game, but it was a game nonetheless. His true objective tonight was not charity or conversation. It was conquest. Across the room, through a parting in the human sea, he saw his target. Julian Croft, the aging CEO of Cybercore Dynamics. Croft was the final gatekeeper, the last signature needed to finalize a merger that would redefine the landscape of their industry. It was a deal Spencer had been chasing for 2 years, a complex, brutal chess match of acquisitions, leveraging, and sheer force of will. Tonight was the checkmate. He felt Claire lean against his leg, a silent signal that her patience for adult affairs was wearing thin. He understood. This was no place for a child, for Starlight. But he couldn't leave her with a nanny tonight. Not tonight. This victory was as much for her future as it was for his legacy. He wanted her here, even if she was hidden in the wings for the final act. He guided her toward a slightly less crowded alcove, dominated by a ridiculously large potted ficus. The spot was out of the main currents of traffic but still offered a clear view of the ballroom. He knelt again, his gaze serious now. "All right, Starlight, here's the mission should you choose to accept it." He produced a small glass of apple juice from a passing waiter's tray. "You are going to hold this position like a super spy. I have to go talk to that man with the white hair for just a few minutes. It's the last level of the video game. Can you do that for me?" Claire's face lit up at the mention of a mission. She took the glass, her small hands holding it with a newfound sense of purpose. "I'll be on watch, Daddy. I won't let any bad guys get past." "You're the best agent I've ever had," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that felt out of place in this sterile environment. He squeezed her shoulder gently, a final, reassuring touch. The urge to stay, to forget the deal and take her home to read stories, was a physical pull. But he was too close. He stood, and in that moment the transformation was complete. The loving father receded, and the formidable billionaire took his place. His shoulders straightened, his jaw set, and his eyes took on the hard, calculating glint that had made him a legend. He turned and began to walk toward Julian Croft, a silent predator closing in on his prize. Behind him, Claire Reed stood her post by the plant, a tiny shimmering figure in a vast, gilded cage, clutching her glass of juice. She was a beacon of innocence, alone for just a moment in a room full of people who had long ago traded theirs away. Across the ballroom, Spencer Reed sealed the future of his company with a final, firm handshake. The ink on the contracts was metaphorically dry, the digital signatures were irrevocably locked. Julian Croft, the old lion of cybercore dynamics, offered a respectful nod. It was done. 2 years of relentless strategy, of sleepless nights and brutal negotiations, had culminated in this quiet moment of absolute victory. A surge of pure, unadulterated triumph washed over Spencer, a feeling so potent it was almost dizzying. He had not just won, he had conquered. He turned, his face breaking into a rare, unguarded smile, his eyes already searching the crowd for the one person he wanted to share it with. His starlight. On her designated watch post, Claire stood with the solemn focus of a palace guard. She was surrounded by a forest of legs clad in expensive wool and shimmering satin. The murmur of adult voices was a river of sound she couldn't quite understand, but she held her ground, clutching her glass of apple juice like a precious artifact. She scanned the crowd for her father's face, her little brow furrowed in concentration. Her mission was to wait, and she was the best agent he'd ever had. Catching a glimpse of what looked like her father's dark suit moving near the grand staircase, she shifted her weight for a better view. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, a child's pivot on the balls of her feet. In that fractional second, her small body, still mastering the nuances of perfect balance, listed backward. She bumped into something that was not the potted ficus but was just as solid, though far less forgiving. A single golden drop of apple juice escaped her glass, arcing through the air in a slow, fateful trajectory before landing squarely on the pristine pointed toe of a white designer heel. The silence that immediately followed was more jarring than a shout. Claire looked up, her blue eyes wide with alarm, and found herself pinned by the iciest glare she had ever seen. The woman was tall and statuesque, her silver blonde hair sculpted into an elaborate, unmoving coif. Her glacial blue eyes were not angry, they were disgusted, as if she'd just discovered something verminous crawling on her person. This was Genevieve Caldwell, a woman who navigated the world as if it were her personal estate, and everyone in it was trespassing. "Watch where you're going, you little pest," she hissed, her voice a low, sharp shard of glass that cut through the nearby chatter. A small circle of silence expanded around them as nearby guests turned, their faces a mixture of curiosity and cruel anticipation. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Claire stammered, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. "It was an accident." Genevieve glanced down at her shoe, at the single glistening bead of juice, as if it were a fatal stain. "An accident?" she repeated, her voice rising just enough to capture her audience. She looked back at Claire, her gaze sweeping over the child's beautiful custom-made dress with undisguised contempt. "Do you have any idea how much these shoes cost?" she asked, the question a rhetorical weapon. "They are worth more than your parents will ever make in their miserable lives." The insult was so absurdly out of proportion that it hung in the air, vibrating with malice. Claire flinched, her lip trembling. She had never been spoken to like this. But Genevieve was not finished. She was a performer, and she had found her stage. "Sorry doesn't clean my shoe," she sneered, leaning closer. "But perhaps you can still be of some use." Before Claire could react, before anyone in the watching crowd could so much as breathe, Genevieve's perfectly manicured hand shot out. Her fingers, cold and strong, latched onto the delicate silk of Claire's skirt. There was a sound, not a simple tear, but a sickening shriek of fine fabric parting under strain. It was the sound of something beautiful being irrevocably broken. Claire gasped, a choked, terrified sound. She looked down in disbelief. A huge, jagged piece of her moonlight-colored dress was now in Genevieve Caldwell's hand. The perfect skirt, her princess gown, was ruined, hanging in tatters around her legs. Tears welled, hot and silent, in her eyes. With a look of theatrical disgust, Genevieve knelt. Not with care, not with remorse, but with a cold, calculated contempt that was meant to be seen. She took the torn piece of silk, the fabric that had been crafted with such care, the dress that had made Claire feel like starlight, and viciously scrubbed the single tiny drop of juice from her shoe. She ground the silk into the leather, smearing the juice into a dull, sticky smudge. Then she stood up, a triumphant sneer twisting her perfect lips. She looked at the soiled, wrinkled piece of fabric in her hand and, with a flick of her wrist, tossed it to the polished marble floor. It landed like a wilted flower, a piece of discarded trash. "There," Genevieve said, her voice ringing with satisfaction in the stunned silence. "At least you're good for something." It was at that exact moment that Spencer Reed found his daughter. The triumphant smile from his landmark deal was still on his face as his eyes scanned the crowd. He saw her, not by the plant where he'd left her, but in the center of a small, gaping circle of onlookers. He saw her small, trembling frame. He saw the gaping hole in her dress. He saw the soiled piece of silk lying on the floor. And he saw the tall, blonde woman towering over her, her face a mask of smug cruelty. The smile on Spencer's face didn't fade, it shattered. The warmth of his victory evaporated, replaced by a sudden, arctic cold that seized his heart. The air in his lungs turned to ice. The roaring ballroom, the chandeliers, the entire gilded world of power and money around him dissolved into a meaningless blur. His universe narrowed to a single horrifying tableau. His crying daughter, her torn dress, and the triumphant sneer of the woman who had done it. This wasn't just an insult. It was a desecration. Time in the grand ballroom seemed to warp around Spencer Reed as he moved. The curious and horrified whispers of the onlookers died in their throats. The string quartet, which had been playing a polite Vivaldi, faltered into silence. He walked not with the hurried gait of an angry man, but with the terrifyingly placid deliberation of a force of nature. The crowd, sensing the shift in the room's gravitational center, parted before him like water before the prow of a battleship. He didn't spare a single glance for Genevieve Caldwell. She had ceased to exist for him, a piece of irrelevant, ugly furniture in the landscape of his daughter's pain. His world had narrowed to one focal point, Claire. He reached her and knelt, his movements fluid and precise. Without a word, he shrugged off his tuxedo jacket, a garment worth more than most people's cars, and wrapped it around his daughter's trembling shoulders. The jacket swallowed her small frame, a cocoon of dark wool that hid her torn dress and tear-streaked face from the predatory eyes of the gala. It was an act of shielding, of reclamation. She was his, and he was taking her back from this place. "It's okay, Starlight," he whispered, his voice a low, steady anchor in her storm. "Daddy's here." A large man with a discreet earpiece, Spencer's head of security, materialized at his side. "Riggs," Spencer said, his voice never rising above a murmur, "take her to the car. Now." Riggs nodded once, his expression impassive, and gently scooped Claire up. As he carried her away from the scene, Spencer rose to his full height and finally turned. He faced not just Genevieve but also her husband, Harrison Caldwell, who had just arrived, his face a mask of annoyance that was rapidly curdling into dawning horror as he recognized the man his wife had provoked. Spencer's eyes, chips of blue ice, met Genevieve's. They held no heat, no rage. They held something far worse, a profound and absolute finality. "You tore my daughter's dress," he said. The statement was not an accusation, it was a verdict. It hung in the dead air, impossibly heavy. He then shifted his gaze to Harrison, the man whose empire was unknowingly in its final moments. "To wipe your shoe." Harrison opened his mouth, a sputtering apology or a panicked denial ready to form. He never got the chance. Spencer's gaze shifted to him. "Your wife," he said, his voice still dangerously quiet, "just put a price on your entire life's work. And it was one drop of juice." Before Harrison could process the chilling calculus of that statement, Spencer pulled out his phone. He didn't move away for privacy. He made the call right there, a public execution. The phone rang once before a voice answered. Leo, Spencer said, his tone flat and devoid of emotion. The Caldwell deal is dead. All of them. Start liquidating our holdings in his company and short it into the ground. Call in every marker we have on any bank that finances him. I want him to feel this by morning. He hung up. The entire call lasted less than 15 seconds. A violent vibration started in Harrison's pocket. He pulled out his phone to see a notification from his bank. A 9-figure construction loan had been immediately recalled, citing a breach of a secondary collateral clause he didn't even know existed. Then another alert. The anchor tenant for his new flagship skyscraper had just invoked a morals clause to terminate their 50-year lease, effective immediately. It wasn't just an attack, it was a systemic annihilation, precise and impossibly fast. Genevieve, however, remained insulated by a lifetime of unshakable arrogance. "Don't be so dramatic," she scoffed, though a flicker of uncertainty now touched her eyes. "Harrison, tell this man to calm down." But Harrison was staring at his phone, his face ashen. He knew Spencer Reed's reputation. He knew this wasn't a tantrum. This was an extinction-level event. He looked at his wife, then back at Spencer, a desperate, pleading look in his eyes. Spencer simply held his gaze for a second longer before turning his back on them both and walking away, leaving the Caldwells standing in the ruins of a life they didn't yet know was already over. Harrison grabbed Genevieve's arm, his grip bruising. "What did you do?" he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and sheer terror. She pulled her arm away, her pride refusing to bend. "I handled a rude child," she snapped. "He'll get over it. Men like him are just new money brutes. Our world has rules. He can't touch us." Genevieve's sneer lingered in the air. "She believes her status puts her above basic decency. If you believe no amount of money can buy class, hit subscribe. Only people who think bullying is okay won't." The sun that rose over the Caldwell's sprawling Beacon Hill estate the next morning felt like an unwelcome intruder. While the city awoke to a crisp autumn day, Harrison Caldwell was living through a digital blizzard. His home office, usually a sanctuary of polished mahogany and quiet power, had become a war room where he was the sole casualty. Every screen he owned was a cascade of red. Stock alerts screamed of a catastrophic sell-off of his company's shares. Urgent emails from his board detailed credit lines being frozen and joint ventures collapsing. Spencer Reed wasn't just attacking. He was methodically dismembering a legacy that had taken 3 generations to build. "He's an animal," Harrison muttered, his voice hoarse. He hadn't slept. Genevieve swept into the room, a silk robe flowing behind her. In stark contrast to her husband's disheveled panic, she was the picture of defiance. "Then we will be hunters," she said, her voice brittle. "I will not be ruined by some Silicon Valley savage and his brat." "Ruined? Genevieve, we are already ruined." Harrison gestured wildly at the screens. "He's not just selling stocks, he's poisoning the well. He's calling in favors, pulling regulatory strings. This is a scorched earth campaign. And we will fight fire with fire," she insisted. Her eyes, usually cold, now held a feverish glint. This was no longer about a spilled drink. It was an existential battle for her world. "You built this city's skyline. These people, the media, the council, they are our people. You will call Miranda Thorne at Apex PR. You will tell her I need her. And you will pay her whatever she asks." An hour later, Miranda Thorne, a woman who looked less like a publicist and more like a high-end assassin, sat across from them. Her face was a canvas of calculated empathy. She had listened to their version of the story without a flicker of judgment. "The truth is irrelevant," Miranda said, her voice smooth and clinical. "The security footage will eventually surface. We cannot win on facts. Therefore we will win on narrative. We will make this a story about class, stability, and fear." She laid out the strategy with chilling precision. "Mr. Reed is new money. That makes him volatile, unstable in the public imagination. We will lean into that. He is the tech tyrant. The unhinged billionaire who terrorizes a respected philanthropist over a minor mishap. Claire," she said the name with a delicate distaste, "is not an innocent victim. She is an unruly, unsupervised child, a product of a parent who values money over manners. And you, Genevieve," Miranda's eyes locked onto hers, "are the real victim. A pillar of the community, a woman who was terrified, who acted clumsily under duress, and is now being bullied by a man with unlimited power. The first volley was fired before noon. A major society tabloid, one in which Harrison held significant influence through a network of shell corporations, hit the digital newsstands. The front-page story was a masterpiece of character assassination. Tech tyrant terrorizes philanthropist Genevieve Caldwell over minor mishap. The article, quoting a dozen anonymous witnesses, painted a lurid picture of Spencer's chilling and disproportionate rage. It described him as a man visibly unhinged, whose public meltdown had left onlookers fearing for their safety. Genevieve was portrayed as a concerned citizen who had merely attempted to teach a stranger's child a lesson in decorum. The torn dress was a footnote, an unfortunate result of a chaotic situation. The masterstroke, however, came at 9 a.m. the following morning. Genevieve Caldwell, dressed in a soft, cream-colored cashmere sweater that screamed vulnerability, sat down for an exclusive interview on the nation's most-watched morning show. Her hair was down, her makeup subtle. She looked not like a queen but like a wounded bird. She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief as she spoke, her voice trembling with practiced fragility. "I have dedicated my life to this city, to its charities, to its children," she began, her gaze fixed on the camera. "To be painted as some kind of monster, it's been devastating." The host, a man whose network relied on Caldwell advertising revenue, lobbed softball questions. "Tell us what you experienced, Genevieve." "Fear," she answered immediately. "Pure fear. Here was this man, this titan who seemed to lose all control. His eyes, it was a rage I have never seen. I wasn't thinking clearly. My only thought was for the safety of everyone in that room. He was threatening my husband, my family, our legacy, all because his daughter, who had been left completely unattended, had a small accident." Tears welled convincingly. "I may not have handled the situation perfectly. Who would under that kind of pressure? But I am not the villain here. I am a woman who is now being systematically destroyed by a powerful man who believes he is above the rules of civilized behavior." The performance was flawless. The narrative began to take hold. Online forums buzzed with a new, divided energy. Comment sections became a war zone. "She has a point," his reaction was way over the top. "Why was a 7-year-old running around a fancy gala by herself anyway?" Classic new money hothead. Back in their Beacon Hill fortress, the Caldwells watched the interview replayed on every major news channel. The bleeding in their accounts hadn't stopped, but for the first time in 36 hours, they felt a surge of hope. They hadn't won, not yet. But they had landed a blow. They had spun a web of lies so compelling that it was beginning to look like the truth. They had buried the image of a cruel woman and a crying child under the far more compelling story of a volatile man and a terrified victim. The vipers had struck, and now they waited for the poison to work. While the Caldwells' narrative poisoned the airwaves, the top floor of the Reed Dynamics Tower was a cathedral of quiet focus. Spencer Reed's team was in a controlled panic, fielding calls from board members and fielding insults from the digital mob. They brought him printouts of the tabloid headlines, clips of Genevieve's interview, and panicked analyses of the dip in his personal approval ratings. Spencer glanced at it all with the detached interest of a scientist observing a petri dish. He wasn't angry. He was waiting. He had allowed the Caldwells to build their entire defense on a foundation of lies, to climb to the very top of their pedestal of deceit. It was a tactical decision. The higher the climb, the more devastating the fall. He swiveled in his chair to face his communications chief, Anya Sharma, a woman whose calm demeanor was as legendary as his own ruthlessness. "Are they ready?" he asked. Anya nodded, holding up a tablet. 3 angles. Audio scrubbed and synced. Crystal clear. "No press release," Spencer commanded. "No statement. No commentary. We are not engaging their story. We are simply ending it. Post it everywhere. Send the raw files directly to every major news desk in the country. Let the unblinking eye of the camera tell the truth." At precisely 2 p.m. Eastern Time, a single coordinated data drop occurred. On a stark black website with the simple title, "The Bostonian Gala, the Unedited Record," 3 video files appeared. The links proliferated across social media like a digital shockwave. The first video was from a wide-angle security camera positioned high in the ballroom. It showed the entire scene with cold, objective clarity. There was no chaos. There was no threat. There was only a cavernous room of mingling adults and one small child, standing quietly, who made a single accidental misstep. It established the context. Genevieve's entire premise of a chaotic situation was a fabrication. The second video was closer, from a camera above the bar. This one had the audio. The quality was chilling. Every one of Genevieve's words was captured with pristine fidelity. The condescending hiss of "little pest." The dripping contempt in "more than your parents will ever make in their miserable lives." Every syllable was a nail in the coffin of her victimhood. It captured Claire's tiny, terrified voice saying, "It was an accident." But it was the third video that stopped the internet cold. Sourced from a discreet camera integrated into a floral display, it was an intimate, damning close-up. This angle caught it all. It showed the cruel tightening of Genevieve's fingers, the violent, deliberate wrenching motion as she tore the silk. The footage was so clear you could see the individual threads part. It captured the shocking act of her grinding the fabric into her shoe, not as someone flustered, but as someone performing an act of dominance. And most damningly, it captured her face as she tossed the ruined silk to the floor, not the face of a woman under duress, but the smug, triumphant sneer of a bully who had just won. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The digital firestorm that had been simmering against Spencer turned into a global inferno directed squarely at Genevieve Caldwell. The video plays, exposing Genevieve's lies for the world to see. If you think truth should always triumph over manipulation, comment, "Justice for Claire." Let's show the world we don't stand for bullies. Within the hour, #torndress was the #1 trending topic worldwide. #Genevieve Caldwell is over followed close behind. The morning show that had hosted her tearful interview was digitally crucified, its social media pages flooded with accusations of journalistic malpractice. Side-by-side videos appeared everywhere. Genevieve's crocodile tears on the left, the raw footage of her cruelty on the right. It was a brutal, undeniable exposé of her deception. The tabloid that had run the tech tyrant's story quietly deleted the article from its website, but it was too late. Screenshots were everywhere, preserved forever as a monument to their journalistic failure. The anonymous witnesses were exposed as employees and friends of the Caldwells. News headlines, which had been tentatively questioning Spencer, flipped in real time. Reed releases gala footage, sparking outrage against socialite Genevieve Caldwell. The video that silenced the smear campaign. Bully, liar, philanthropist. The unraveling of Genevieve Caldwell. In his office, Spencer Reed watched the data streams. He wasn't watching the news reports. He was watching sentiment analysis charts swing from negative to positive with a velocity his analysts had never seen. He watched the stock of the media company that owned the morning show begin to plummet. He saw the truth deployed not as an argument, but as an irrefutable weapon. He hadn't fought their fire with fire. He had simply turned on the lights, and in the harsh, unforgiving glare, the vipers were revealed to be nothing more than worms. He took a sip of his coffee. The strike was complete. Now he would watch the fallout. The silence was the most brutal weapon of all. In their Beacon Hill mansion, the phones that once chimed with the city's most influential voices had fallen quiet. The invitations that papered their mantelpiece now felt like relics from a forgotten civilization. The Caldwells were no longer just losing, they were being erased. Harrison sat in his office, staring at a terminal that displayed a waterfall of red. Caldwell Holdings, a name once synonymous with Boston's bedrock, was now a penny stock. Their board had called an emergency meeting to demand his resignation. Their oldest allies had issued public statements distancing themselves from the Caldwell controversy. He was a king presiding over a pile of rubble. He looked over at Genevieve, who was standing by the window, staring out at a city that now despised her. She hadn't spoken in hours, her defiant fury having collapsed into a hollow, brittle shell. She was a pariah, a meme, a cautionary tale whispered at the gala she could no longer attend. Miles away and stories high, Spencer Reed stood before a floor-to-ceiling window in his own office. The city spread out below him, a glittering map of his victory. Anya Sharma stood beside him, holding a tablet. Caldwell's top 3 partners have invoked their disrepute clauses and terminated their contracts, she reported, her voice calm. Their credit rating was downgraded to junk status an hour ago. The board is ousting him. Socially, they're radioactive. They've been disinvited from the mayor's winter ball and the symphony gala. Genevieve was removed from the board of the Children's Museum. It's a total system collapse. Spencer gave a slow, deliberate nod. There was no elation on his face, no gloating. There was only the quiet, profound satisfaction of a promise fulfilled. He had delivered an apocalypse wrapped in logic and executed with surgical precision. The threat had been neutralized. The insult to his daughter had been answered with a response so total, so absolute, that it would echo in the halls of Boston's elite for a generation. He had protected his own. The world was back in its proper alignment. He watched the last rays of sun glint off the distant buildings that Harrison Caldwell had built, structures that would stand long after their creator's name was forgotten. From this vantage point, with his enemy's empire in ashes and their reputation annihilated, the fight felt unequivocally, decisively over. Victory was assured. The final blow was ready. On Spencer's screen was a one-click authorization to acquire the last crumbling pillars of Caldwell Holdings for pennies on the dollar. It was a final act of dominance, a digital salting of the earth. His finger hovered over the trackpad, ready to sign the death certificate of his enemy's empire. This was the end. Just as he was about to click, the door to his office slid open without a knock. Only one person had that privilege. Jax, his head of cybersecurity, strode in, his face pale and grim. He wasn't looking at Spencer. He was staring at a tablet in his hand as if it were a venomous snake. "Don't sign it," Jax said, his voice tight. Spencer's hand froze. Jax was a ghost, a man who lived in code and existed in the silent spaces between servers. He never dealt in drama. If he was in the room, the sky was falling. "Why?" "We were doing a final sweep of Caldwell's financials," Jax began, placing the tablet on Spencer's desk. "A digital autopsy. We found something that doesn't fit. Something that's wrong." On the screen was a complex web of transactions. Buried under 3 layers of encryption and routed through a dead-end server in the Caymans, Jax explained, pointing to a single pulsing line of code. A series of payments from an untraceable shell corporation. Name, Nemesis Ventures. Spencer leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Hiding money isn't new. The timing is," Jax countered, his finger tracing the data. "The payment started 3 weeks ago. Small deposits, then larger. A conditioning. But this," he highlighted the final entry. "The last transfer, the largest one, hit Caldwell's offshore account at 7:15 p.m. the night of the gala." The air in the room grew thin. Spencer's mind, a machine built for pattern recognition, began to accelerate. 7:15 p.m. He checked the gala's event log in his memory. Jax delivered the final devastating piece of the puzzle. That was exactly 10 minutes, Spencer. 10 minutes before Claire bumped into Genevieve. The world tilted on its axis. Spencer stared at the screen, but he was no longer seeing data. He was seeing the scene at the gala, replaying it with a horrifying new filter. The accidental bump. The outsized, theatrical cruelty. The perfect public spectacle. It wasn't random. It wasn't a socialite's petty outburst. "They were paid," Spencer whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. The humiliation of his daughter wasn't an act of spontaneous malice. It was a contracted service. A transaction. Harrison and Genevieve weren't the architects of his pain. They were the weapon. He had spent the last 48 hours demolishing a pawn, pouring all his resources and fury into a target that had been deliberately placed in his path. And somewhere, in the shadows, the real enemy, the one who had paid for this entire grotesque performance, was watching. The entire public battle, the media war, the financial collapse. It was all a diversion. A smokescreen. Spencer slowly pulled his hand back from the trackpad. The sense of victory evaporated, replaced by an arctic wave of cold, calculating fury. He had been played. His love for his daughter had been identified as a vulnerability and ruthlessly exploited to draw him into a fight. He looked out the window, but he no longer saw a conquered city. He saw a chessboard, and he had just realized he wasn't the only king on the board. The war hadn't just ended. It had just begun. The victory was ash in Spencer Reed's mouth. The satisfying collapse of the Caldwell Empire, the public vindication, the swift, brutal justice. It all felt like a cheap magic trick now that he'd seen the wires. The rage that had fueled him for 2 days, a white-hot inferno, didn't vanish. It collapsed into a singularity of pure, cold purpose. "Forget the Caldwells," Spencer said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency that made everyone in the room flinch. "They're irrelevant. A symptom. I want the disease." He turned to Jax, whose team was already being summoned. The mood on the top floor shifted from a victory celebration to a council of war. The acquisition of Caldwell Holdings was forgotten. The media narrative was irrelevant. The mission had changed. This was no longer a public execution. It was a ghost hunt. "I want to know everything," Spencer commanded, his eyes fixed on the name of the shell corporation on the tablet. Nemesis Ventures. "I want its creator, its purpose, and everyone it has ever touched. I want the digital equivalent of a soul." Jax nodded grimly. "We're on it." "But Spencer, whoever built this, they're a pro. The encryption is military grade, the servers are ghosts routed through a dozen failed states. This isn't a shell corp, it's a digital fortress." "Then get a bigger cannon," Spencer replied without a flicker of doubt. He led Jax from his pristine office down a private elevator, descending into the nerve center of his empire. They didn't stop at the floors of marketing or R&D. They went to the sublevel, a place known only as the Vault. The Vault was a den of digital hunters, a room humming with the silent power of custom-built servers and cooled by a low, constant whisper of air conditioning. Here worked a team of the best black hat hackers money could legally buy. Cyber mercenaries Spencer paid a fortune to keep on his side of the firewall. They were his unblinking eye, the architects of his digital dominance. When Spencer and Jax entered, the team of 6 operators looked up from their glowing screens. They knew this was not a routine visit. Spencer didn't waste time on pleasantries. The tablet screen was projected onto the massive central display. "This is Nemesis Ventures," he said. "It was used to pay Harrison Caldwell to orchestrate a public attack on my daughter. I want to know who is holding the leash. You have unlimited resources. You have my full authority to go as dark as you need to. Burn whatever you have to burn, break whatever you have to break. Find me the puppeteer." The hunt began. What followed was a silent, frantic ballet of code. The team worked with a terrifying synergy, their fingers flying across keyboards, peeling back layers of encryption that were designed to be unbreakable. They chased digital ghosts through firewalls in Luxembourg, navigated a labyrinth of offshore servers in Panama, and hit dead ends in data havens in Macau. Every time they thought they had a thread, it would dissolve into a cascade of corrupted data, a digital booby trap. Spencer didn't leave. He paced behind them, a caged panther, his mind racing, connecting dots he hadn't seen before. The attack wasn't just personal, it was strategic. The enemy hadn't just used his daughter to hurt him, they had used her to distract him. "He wanted me emotional," Spencer said aloud, the pieces clicking into place. "He wanted me to pour everything into annihilating the Caldwells. He wanted me to be predictable." While his capital and attention were focused on a public spectacle of revenge, his company, Reed Dynamics, was vulnerable. He had been so focused on the puppet show that he hadn't noticed if someone was trying to set the theater on fire. Spencer realizes he's been played by a hidden enemy. It's the kind of backstabbing move that people like the Caldwells enable. If you can't stand seeing schemers win, hit that like button. Let's send a message that we value honesty. Hours bled into one another. Coffee went cold. The sun set, casting long, menacing shadows across the room. Then a breakthrough. "I'm in," one of the operators, a young woman with neon pink hair, whispered. "Not through the front door. I found a back door." A fragment of deprecated code in the shell's architecture, left over from an older build. Jax rushed over. A digital fingerprint. The blow didn't come from the shadows. It came from the bright, sterile floor of the New York Stock Exchange. At 9:31 a.m., just as the morning's trading began, a news alert exploded across every financial terminal in the world. Alastair Finch launches hostile takeover bid for Reed Dynamics. Wall Street, which had been watching the Caldwell drama with the detached amusement of a spectator sport, was thrown into a frenzy. This wasn't a society scandal anymore. This was war. Finch didn't emerge like a cackling villain. He stepped into the spotlight as a savior. In a pre-recorded statement released simultaneously with the bid, he was the picture of sober, reluctant concern. Dressed in a conservative navy suit, he spoke not of revenge but of responsibility. "Reed Dynamics is a cornerstone of American innovation," Finch began, his voice laced with feigned gravity. "But a company of that importance cannot be subject to the emotional whims of a single individual. We have all witnessed the events of the past few days. We have seen a leader who has admittedly poured his company's focus and resources into a deeply personal public vendetta. A leader who, by his own actions, has exposed the company to instability. He was a surgeon, using the scandal Spencer had defeated as a scalpel. He never mentioned Claire. He never mentioned the torn dress. He simply took the narrative of the tech tyrant that the Caldwells had failed to make stick and repurposed it for a far more dangerous audience: the shareholders. The sharks smelled blood. Pundits on financial news networks immediately began debating Spencer's fitness to lead. Has Reed's personal crusade made him a liability? One anchor asked. Finch is making a powerful case for a steady hand at the wheel, another analyst commented. The stock price of Reed Dynamics, which had stabilized, began to plummet as investors panicked. The attack was no longer just external. It was now coming from within. Spencer's phone lit up, not with messages of support but with summonses. An emergency e-meeting of the board had been called. The emails from his board members, once allies, were now cold and clinical, demanding explanations for his recent conduct and its impact on shareholder value. They saw a brilliant founder who now looked like a distracted, emotional father, a liability in a world that worshipped the bottom line. Spencer stood in the center of his office, the world he had built with iron will and relentless focus now besieged on all fronts. His righteous fury, the very force that had driven him to protect his daughter, had been turned against him. Finch had known it would. He had predicted every move. He had built this trap not with code or with money, but with a perfect understanding of Spencer's heart. His obsession with avenging his daughter had left his kingdom vulnerable. The gates had been left open not by an enemy, but by his own righteous, all-consuming love. He was cornered, outmaneuvered, and on the verge of losing everything. The emergency board meeting was held in a sterile virtual space, a cold pantheon of digital faces projected onto a holographic display in the center of Reed Dynamics' boardroom. The 12 members, a Mount Rushmore of old money and new tech, looked down with expressions ranging from grim disappointment to vulture-like opportunism. Spencer sat alone at the head of the long, polished table, an isolated king in his own court. At the other end, projected larger than life, was Alistair Finch. He was the picture of confidence, a maestro conducting his symphony of destruction. He spoke with a smooth, practiced gravitas, laying out his vision to save the company from its erratic founder. The numbers speak for themselves, Finch said as charts and graphs materialized beside his projection, showing the stock's recent volatility. Shareholder value has been compromised. The market requires stability, predictability. What it has witnessed instead is a deeply personal crusade funded by corporate resources. This isn't about punishment, it's about stewardship. I am offering a return to rational, focused leadership. A steady hand to guide this great company out of the storm its founder has sailed it directly into. He was brilliant. He didn't sound like a rival, he sounded like a rescuer. Spencer could see the nods of agreement from the board members. He saw their wavering loyalty collapse under the weight of Finch's inexorable logic. They had built this empire with him, but they would not let it sink for him. It is time for the board to act, Finch concluded, his voice resonating with finality. It is time to restore order. The chairman, a stoic man named Arthur Vance, cleared his throat. Spencer, he said, the name a heavy weight in the silent room. Do you have anything to say before we proceed to a vote on Mr. Finch's tender offer? Spencer looked up, and for the first time he appeared utterly defeated. The fire was gone from his eyes, replaced by a weary resignation. He ran a hand over his face, the picture of a man who had fought and lost. He's right, Spencer said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. The board members leaned forward, stunned by the concession. Finch allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. Alistair is right, Spencer repeated, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. I have been distracted. I allowed a personal attack to consume my focus. I let my emotions dictate my strategy, and in doing so, I exposed this company. I exposed all of you. I failed in my duty to protect shareholder value above all else. For that, I am truly sorry. The apology hung in the air, a stunning admission of defeat. Finch's smile widened. This was better than he could have imagined. Not just a victory, but a total capitulation. Arthur Vance nodded grimly. Thank you, Spencer. We will now proceed. But I'm not finished, Spencer said, his voice suddenly changing. The weariness vanished, replaced by a cold, hard edge that made every person in the room sit bolt upright. The defeated man was gone. In his place was the predator they had all forgotten. You see, my distraction wasn't with the Caldwells, Spencer continued, his eyes locking onto Finch's projection. My distraction for the past 6 months has been you, Alistair. Finch's smile faltered. I knew you were coming back, Spencer said. A man like you doesn't accept exile. You fester. You plot. So I started preparing. I built a trap. A very specific, very expensive trap, and I baited it with the one thing I knew you couldn't resist. The illusion of my weakness. He gestured to the screen. That merger I signed at the gala with Cybercore Dynamics? It wasn't a merger. It was a Trojan horse. A poison pill I commissioned Julian Croft to help me design, specifically for you. A murmur of confusion went through the board. Finch's face had gone rigid. Let me read you 2 clauses from the contract's addendum, Spencer said as the text appeared on the main screen. Clause 11b. In the event of a hostile takeover bid initiated by any entity financially linked to a pre-designated list of shell corporations, a list which I'm sure you'll be delighted to know includes Nemesis Ventures, Reed Dynamics will automatically issue 10 million new preferred shares to a pre-selected, long-term and unbreakably loyal private holding company. You let that sink in. In other words, the moment you made your move, your acquisition became a financial impossibility. You'd be trying to buy a company with stock that dilutes into infinity. You'd bankrupt yourself. Finch was no longer breathing. He was a statue of pure panic. But that's just the defensive measure, Spencer said, his voice turning to ice. I'm more of an offensive player. Let's look at Clause 11c. The same trigger, your bid, also executes an automatic encrypted data transfer from a secure server directly to a pre-designated contact in the SEC's enforcement division. A transfer containing a rather comprehensive dossier. 5 years of your offshore accounts, your illegal market manipulation, your insider trading. Everything. He paused, letting the full weight of the statement crush the room. That transfer, Alistair, completed 12 minutes ago. As if on cue, Finch's personal phone, visible on his desk, began to vibrate violently. A notification from his bank. A federal asset freeze. You see, the gala wasn't your trap for me, Spencer said, standing now. It was my trap for you. I needed you to believe you had me on the ropes. I needed you to make a public move. And to ensure there was no ambiguity. He swiped his hand and a new video appeared on the screen. It was grainy security footage from the Four Seasons Hotel bar, dated 1 week before the gala. It showed 2 men at a secluded table. Harrison Caldwell. And Alistair Finch. I needed proof of collusion, Spencer finished. Proof that you hired him to create the very crisis you are now proposing to solve. Checkmate. Finch didn't speak. He simply stared, his face a mask of utter devastation, the architect of a grand scheme who had just discovered he was nothing but a pawn in a far grander one. The board members looked from Finch's crumbling projection to Spencer, who stood before them not as a compromised father, but as the most ruthless, brilliant strategist they had ever known. He hadn't been distracted. He had been hunting. Spencer turns the tables on the ultimate manipulator. It's a victory against every backstabbing villain. If you love seeing bullies and schemers get exactly what they deserve, comment, checkmate, below. The fallout was a silent, digital tsunami. The ghost of Alistair Finch was exorcised from Wall Street, his assets frozen and his future a bleak landscape of federal indictments. Harrison Caldwell, implicated in the conspiracy, traded his Beacon Hill mansion for a federal holding cell. And Genevieve, abandoned and bankrupted by the husband she had helped ruin, vanished completely, her name becoming a cautionary tale whispered in the very social circles she once dominated. 6 months later, Spencer Reed stood on a different stage. There were no crystal chandeliers, no sharks in tuxedos. This was a bright, modern auditorium filled not with the elite, but with educators, child psychologists, and families. Beside him, holding his hand, was Claire. Her dress was whole, her smile was radiant, and her eyes held no memory of the shadows from that night. This was the launch of the Claire Foundation, a multi-billion-dollar initiative dedicated to creating and funding anti-bullying programs in schools across the nation. Spencer looked out at the hopeful faces in the crowd, his own face clear of the cold fury that had driven him. He had won the war, but he had learned in the process that victory was a hollow prize. True power wasn't a weapon for destroying enemies, but a tool for building a shield big enough for everyone. He had taken the rage he felt that night and forged it into a foundation of protection, ensuring that countless other children would never have to feel the sting of a bully's cruelty. His love for his daughter had become his legacy for the world. The villains are defeated, but the world is still full of people who think they can get away with it. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you want more stories where justice is served and the arrogant get their comeuppance. Don't let the Genevieves of the world have the last word.